Our message this morning is in Genesis 11. We're continuing on. This will be the second to last message before we're actually done with this story, done with this series, going through the line of Noah. And this is in Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. The subject matter is the Tower of Babel. And so, again, when I say that, it's one of those stories. Please don't immediately disregard it because you've heard it before. Okay? So just hang in there. But we're going to look just 9 verses this morning. Verses 1 through 9 of Genesis 11. The Tower of Babel. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of the earth. Now first, on a note of that last line, where therefore the name is called Babel, we don't say, it wasn't called Babel because there was that, you think of people babbling. We say people are babbling because of this, of this event. And the reason, therefore, it was called Babel is because Babel means confusion. It means confusion. So kind of to summarize this text, you've got the people of the earth wanting to make a name for themselves. And at a glance, when you read this story, especially if it's your first time reading the story or all that you're familiar with is Christian movies or books that kind of play on this story, when you read it again for either the first time or for real, I should say, in Scripture, you're kind of faced with maybe at a glance, it's like, well, what did they actually do wrong? Because it's like they just were building a tower and wanting to make a name for themselves. But the problem is that this was a means by which they were trying to oppose God. It was a means by which they opposed God. And so then God creates many languages, and the human race leads them to spread across the earth and eventually giving up their plans here. But one moment, sorry. So that's the general summary of the story, essentially. And the way that you can kind of divide this text is first in verses 1 through 4, you have mankind rebels. And then in verses 5 through 9, God responds. So that might be a simpler way to think of it, sort of in chunks there. And I want to first address this notion that mankind is rebelling here. There's a weird starting point that we have. You see, now the whole earth had one language and the same words. It's not much of a once upon a time. that it gives you there. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. An interesting opener for a story. And again, if I'm reading this for the first time, I'm wondering why that's a necessary detail to include at all. If I'm first reading this, okay, the whole earth had one language and the same words. It's like, okay, so what? So I wonder why they include the detail, let alone start the whole story off with it. And it isn't until the end of the story in verse 9 that you see, that you kind of see a reasoning for it. If you remember verse 9, it says, therefore its name was called Babel, because the Lord confused the language from all the earth. And so at first they have one language and the same words, and at the end, then the language is confused. And so you can maybe see why in verse 9 it gives the reader a distinct point A to point B contrast. And therein also lies some foreshadowing, because, the mention of a point A points to the possibility of an eventual point B. And so that would be why the story would start off right like that. It sort of brackets the story. And the question posed then is how did we get here? Right? How did we get from point A to point B? If you've ever had an argument with a spouse or a loved one, sometimes you have to pause the argument. There's a conflict, and you just sort of have to pause the argument and just ask, how did we get here? How did we get here? There was a point A in our day when there wasn't any conflict, and now we're at point B where there is. And it's how did that happen? So similarly to that sort of phenomenon, the text is begging the reader to ask this question about the text. It's begging the reader to ask this question. How did we get from point A, where the whole earth had one language and the same words, to point B, where it's confused? They were speaking the same language, and now they're not speaking the same language. And you need to find out why that is and learn from it. That's the mission of this text. So back to the relationship sort of illustration. It's I use Kaylee as an example just because she's the closest thing to me, but you can use anyone. You just fill them in, but it's like if you're arguing with them, it's like, man, we were speaking the same language, but now we're not. It's like I feel like we were speaking the same language, and now it's just we're not. Now I should include that this metaphor, it falls short here, right? Because when Kaylee and I do wrong by each other, we're doing just that. We're doing wrong by each other. And yes, I guess indirectly, when I do wrong by her, I do wrong by God. But what I mean is directly, I'm doing wrong by her rather than, we're not setting ourselves up as, in intentional or willful opposition to a perfect sinless judge, right? Or to the Almighty God of the universe, right? So when I do wrong, I can suggest, I can suggest to Kaylee, when we're not speaking the same language, I can suggest the big three, which is Target, Ulta, and Starbucks, And I say those three things, and all of a sudden, we're speaking the same language again. And she can, if she wrongs me, she can suggest my big three, right? Which is chow mein, orange chicken, and honey walnut shrimp from Panda Express. And then as soon as she says that, we're speaking the same language. So the metaphor falls short. But in backtracking her and I's conflict, though, usually it's a tale as old as time, right? When we think of how did we get from point A to point B, it's okay, maybe I've told a joke that was too far, or, I start talking about my day in the middle of her talking about her day, or on her end, it's like maybe I'm really excited about something, and she kind of shrugs it off, so it's like, just common things, and it's like, okay, tale as old as time, of course that's what it was, when trying to address. And it's similar in this story. It's like, where did we go wrong? How did we get from point A to point B in this conflict? I think of the major events throughout Genesis 1 to 11 that we've gone both in our last series in Genesis as well as this one. You think of the creation of the universe, the fall of man, the flood, and now the attempt to build this tower. Each time mankind disobeys the Lord, and the Lord judges their sin and creates a new beginning. It's a tale as old as time. Right? Adam and Eve sin. God judges them and then promises to send the world a redeemer. Cain kills Abel. God sends Seth to carry on a righteous line. Sethites intermarry with the Cainites. God brings a flood, but then creates a new beginning through righteous Noah. Well, Noah says, Noah's sons repopulate the earth. And now something has gone wrong, and we've got to figure it out from here. So foreshadowing in mind, it's like, I think it's gonna be the same tale told once more in this story. Verse 2, and as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. We might read through this, but this is actually the first part where it goes wrong. And this is confirmed even, there's the archaeological evidence that people lived here. So they migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they settled there. So where they went wrong, I should add, is twofold. All right, this is the first point, and I'll come back to that. Verse 3, they said to another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And why burn bricks? Just as a cultural note for understanding the story, I found out mud bricks, they can either simply dry in the heat of the sun, or the stronger ones were fired in or burnt in kilns, which is something like a old oven, I guess, if that makes sense. So it's brick would be the chosen building material in Mesopotamia. It was a lot more abundant than stone, and so this was the means by which they just accomplished their task. In verse 4, then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." And this is where this is where I said it was twofold what they do wrong. This is the second part. So first it was settling in the land of Shinar, and the second thing here is trying to build themselves a city with a tower in their own name, and trying to make a name for themselves. Right? If you recall, when we were in chapter 10, that large table of nations, where I was reading all the names. In verses 8 through 10, it says, Cush fathered Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. So that, remember, that came after this. That talks about the dispersion. For literary sake, this came next, even though it didn't come next chronologically. You read of it next, so it opens up into talking about Abram, a little bit better. But that came. That describes this. That came after this event in the Tower of Babel. So that's. So while dispersing, and this is what John MacArthur noted about this text. He says, while dispersing, a portion of the post-flood group, under the leading of the powerful Nimrod, decided to stop and establish a city as a monument to their pride and for their reputation. The tower, even though it was part of the plan, was not a singular act of rebellion. Sort of like I was saying. He said, human pride, which led these people to defy God. They were refusing to fill the earth as they had been instructed. In fact, this was Nimrod's and the people's effort to disobey the command of God in chapter 9, verse 1. Which, of course, was, and God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. They're not dispersing into the earth and filling it. They're settling. They're not moving. They say, we want to build a city here for our name's sake. So it is a twofold thing that they do wrong here. They settle when they're not supposed to, and they build this tower for their name's sake, for the glorification of their name's sake, rather than to the one true God of Israel. So this is the rebellion of mankind in verses 1 through 4. And now in verses 5 through 9, God responds. Let's see if the tale follows as expected, right? God responds in verse 5. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. Interesting choice of words there, right? The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. This choice of words isn't literal. Rather, it's sort of tongue-in-cheek. Right, the Lord didn't actually come down. He's omniscient. He's omnipresent. What he's saying here is, okay, these guys constructed their building all the way to the heavens, and as high as they possibly could, to the peaks that mankind could create anything, and still the Lord has to come down to it. Does that make sense? So it's kind of it's ironically just a way of saying that God still, even at this point, had to descend to reach them. And continuing this sort of, I guess this way of speaking, the Lord says in verse 6, behold, they are one people. They all have one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. This here is the only beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do now will be impossible for them. By saying nothing's impossible for them, he's not saying, oh, they can do anything. Like they're so mighty and powerful. It's like, no, he has to descend to them. By saying that nothing they do is impossible, will be impossible for them, he's saying they're unified in opposition to me, and they will do everything that they desire to do. They're going to do everything they desire to do. And so then in verse 7 he says, come, let us go down there and confuse their language so that they may not understand one's speech. Another interesting choice of words here. Let us go down here? What does that say to the reader about what kind of God this is? The reader immediately says, oh, we're not dealing with, he's not like the other ones. We're not dealing with the same guy here. We're not worshiping, this is... He's saying, not only do I have to descend to you, even at your peak, he's saying, it's his way of suggesting to them, or letting them know that he is a deity that is far more complex in personhood than other gods. He says, you have such a low view of me that you think you can reach me. I still have to descend to you, even at your highest point. And I'm far more complex than you're giving me credit for being. Let us go down there and confuse their language, right? And that to me, it falls straight in with a Trinitarian view of God. The fact that it's in us. Why? So that they may not understand one another's speech. All right, so there's the judgment. Okay, so the tale's coming into fruition here. There's the judgment. But where's the new beginning? Verse 9 says, therefore, its name was called Babel, meaning confusion, right? Because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of the earth. I'll go ahead and give you a hint. The new beginning doesn't start in these 1 through 9. It starts later in the rest of the chapter. Next week is our last Sunday in this series with the introduction of Abram. There's your new beginning. But for here, we'll leave this Sunday with his judgment. So the tale is old as time, right? The name Babel is translated as Babylon everywhere else in the Old Testament from here. Babylon becomes a symbolic of human opposition to God and basically the antithesis of the kind of city that God would actually want to have constructed here on earth. Babel is the exact opposite of that kind of city. So it's sort of a city that instead of thy kingdom come as their mantra would be my kingdom come. That's Babel for you. That's Babylon. Right? And so God responds to this mentality, this my kingdom come mentality and action twofold once more, right? As the judgment here and a new beginning offered with the arrival of Abram in next week's sermon. But first, where do we go with this passage? What are we to take from it? I want to say this. I believe that when it comes to sanctification, there are two, arguably three concepts that are most crucial. And the first thing is a high concept of God. When it comes to sanctification, a high concept of God is the most important thing. And secondly, a realistic concept of self. And arguably three, I say, would be a loving concept of others. But I think if you get number one right, you show that by loving others. So there's a lot within each of these categories. But when it comes to sanctification, the two most important things we can gather to spur us forward and bridge the gap between initial and progressive is this: a high concept of God and a realistic concept of yourself. The more lofty our view of God, the more likely we are to live and die to the mantra, thy kingdom come. And the less realistically we understand ourselves, the more our pride will take precedence over the glorification of God in his name's sake. And we've got to put these two motions in proper view. And this text helps us to do just that. It helps us to do just that. I mean, look back at verse 4. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top and in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Let us make a name for ourselves. So right off the bat, you have an unrealistic concept of self, right? You don't realize who you are. And you have a very low concept of God. You don't realize who he is, right? Because even at your peak, he still descends to you. Contrast that verse with the mentality of take Psalm 72:17, for instance. May his name endure forever. May his name endure forever and continue as long as the sun. May people be blessed in him. All nations call him blessed. I mean, think of that in contrast to verse 4. We want to make a name for ourselves versus may his name endure forever. And so now, I don't know if you've ever seen, what is it, VeggieTales. You know, where he's like, now's the part of the show where Larry comes out and sings a silly song. Now's the part of the sermon where Isaac quotes Spurgeon. Now's the time of the sermon with Spurgeon quotes with Isaac. The part of the sermon where Isaac makes an application using a sermon quote. So here's Spurgeon's thoughts on Psalm 72:17. Preached a sermon on it, though I couldn't find a sermon on Tower of Babel. He says this: men have said of many of their works, they shall endure forever. But how much have they been disappointed? In the age succeeding the flood, they made the brick, they gathered the slime, and when they had piled old Babel's tower, they said, this shall last forever. But God confounded their language. They finished it not. By his hand he destroyed it and left it a monument of their folly. Old Pharaoh and the Egyptian monarchs heaped up their pyramids, and they said, they shall stand forever. And so indeed they do stand. But the time is approaching when age shall devour even these. So with all the proudest works of men, whether they have been his temples or his monarchies, he has written everlasting on them. But God has ordained their end, and they have passed away. The most stable things have been evanescent as shadows, and the bubbles of an hour speedily destroyed at God's bidding. Where is Nineveh? And where is Babylon? Where is the cities of Persia? Where are the high places of Edom? Where are Moab and the princes of Ammon? Where are the temples or the heroes of Greece? Where are the millions that passed from the gates of Thebes? Where are the hosts of Xerxes? Or where are the vast armies of the Roman emperors? Have they not also passed away? Man calls his works eternal. God calls them fleeting. Man conceives that they are built of rock. God says, nay, sand, or worse than that, they are air. Man says he erects them for eternity. God blows but for a moment, and where are they? Like baseless fabrics of a vision, they are past and gone forever. It is pleasant then to find that there is one thing which is to last forever. Spurgeon says this: concerning that one thing we hope to speak tonight, if God will enable me to preach and you to hear, his name shall endure forever. First, the religion sanctified by his name shall endure forever. Secondly, the honor of his name shall endure forever. And thirdly, the saving, comforting power of his name shall endure forever. Contrast that with verse 4. They built it for so that their namesake will live on. And I read this and I think of men and women today and the temples they build in honor of themselves. Careers that will replace them readily upon their death. I think of ministers who build their churches also as temples glorifying their names. May I instead be like Zinzendorf, who once said, preach the gospel, die, and be forgotten. May that be my aim as well. Because it's not my name that matters at all. And on that note, if I must be remembered at all, let me be like Spurgeon then. Spurgeon once said, they will not stop me from speaking of Jesus. And even when I die, they will speak of me speaking of Jesus. So if I am to be remembered at all, let it be still for the glorification of his name's sake. Folks, no matter the context, his name alone stands forever. You can spend 1,000 lifetimes building temples to yourself and they will fall. Or you can spend an eternity glorifying a namesake that endures forever. And whatever choice, whichever you choose. I know for me personally, when I hear the latter, I can't help but think, now you're speaking my language. Let's pray.